In a quiet Pennsylvania town, a beloved Catholic schoolteacher vanished on her way to confession one snowy evening. For 7 years, her disappearance haunted the community until a demolition crew uncovering the old church chimney found a hidden letter, signed A.H. What it revealed would unravel secrets buried deep within the church walls and shake the town to its core. The morning of November 3rd had begun like any other in the sleepy town of Colburn, a quiet suburb tucked on the outer edge of Albany, New York. The trees that lined Whitman Road were just beginning to shed their final leaves, leaving crisp amber and rust-colored fragments fluttering across the sidewalks. The air carried the scent of wet earth and chimney smoke, the kind of smell that came with the slow shift toward winter. At St. Bernadette's Catholic School, tucked modestly between a field of overgrown grass and the aging chapel of St. Matthew's, the school bell rang promptly at 8:00 a.m. But for the first time in 10 years, Miss Alice Harper didn't show up to unlock her classroom. Alice was known for her quiet devotion. At 32, she had been both a teacher and a nun in the Sisters of Mercy order, living alone in the small rectory house beside the chapel. Every Thursday before school, she would make her walk, or, when weather allowed, ride her second-hand Schwinn bike to St. Matthew's for private confession. Father Mulligan, the parish priest, would open the side gate for her just after 7:15, then close it by 7:45 so she could make her way back in time for morning prayers with the children. It was a routine, fixed, predictable, but on that morning she never arrived. The first sign something was wrong came when Mrs. Dorsey, the school's receptionist, called her classroom to inform Alice that a parent was waiting. The phone rang out unanswered. By 8:30, Principal Margaret Cleary walked down the hallway herself, knocked, then opened the classroom to find the lights off, the chairs still stacked on desks. The crucifix on the far wall hung slightly tilted, a detail she wouldn't recall until much later. Police were called by 10:00 p.m. By noon, the school had shifted into a quiet panic. A search began with the surrounding neighborhood, volunteers canvassing sidewalks, ditches, and the thin line of woods behind the church. That afternoon, just after 2:00 p.m., a crossing guard found Alice's bicycle lying on its side near the foot of St. Mary's Hill. The back wheel was still turning lazily. Her bag was gone. There were no tire marks, no skid, no struggle. Just a single silver key lying in the grass beside the curb. Sheriff Daniel Coyle stood at the scene, squinting against the slanted sunlight, his fingers resting just above his belt. "Could have slipped," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "But where's the damn bag?" The townspeople whispered among themselves, some in concern, others in that low-tinged fear that suddenly violated. Alice wasn't just a teacher. She had become something of a fixture, someone children drew pictures of and parents trusted without question. She helped organize holiday food drives, and every spring she led a choir of 22nd graders through hymns so sweet they made even the stoniest dads tear up during Palm Sunday Mass. For days after, volunteers kept searching. The church hosted vigils. A few detectives even went door to door in the colder neighborhoods further down the hill. But nothing turned up. No body, no witness, no sound. Her room in the rectory was untouched. Her journal, opened on her desk, held only her to-do list for the week. Finish bulletin board, speak to Father Mulligan about Advent materials, return library books. On her bedside table sat a small alarm clock, still ticking. Her slippers were placed neatly under the edge of the bed, but inside her closet, the confessional shawl, an old knit wrap she always brought on chilly mornings, was missing. The investigation officially began the next day, but by then speculation had already taken root. Some whispered of runaways, others of suicide, but no note was left, no bank account touched, no passport missing. Alice Harper had simply vanished. Mid-road, mid-life, mid-life. Sheriff Coyle's team investigated Father Mulligan first. He was the last known person to expect her that morning, but his testimony was clear. She never arrived. I waited, even lit a candle for her. The surveillance system at the back of the church hadn't functioned in months. Budget cuts, the diocese had claimed. And though the side alley camera at O'Connell's hardware store faced toward the chapel fence, the morning fog had been heavy that day, obscuring anything more than shadow. Days became weeks. Posters appeared in grocery store windows and beside the pharmacy register. Her photograph, a soft, pale face under a blue scarf, became both a beacon and a wound. People stared too long, Children asked quiet questions. By the time winter came, the snow had covered St. Mary's Hill entirely, erasing the spot where the bicycle had lain. The wheel, now long stopped, was stored as evidence in a police locker. Nothing else had emerged. No tips, no ransom, no trace. And so the file was quietly labeled Missing Person, Active/Unresolved, and slid into a drawer already too full. By the third week of Alice Harper's disappearance, the tone of the investigation had shifted. The candles that once flickered on the chapel's altar during community vigils were now replaced with silence, and the posters in shop windows began curling at the edges. Sheriff Coyle stood at the whiteboard inside his office, now cluttered with maps, timelines, and photographs of Alice's classroom, her modest room in the rectory, and most prominently, a name: Martin Dale. The name had surfaced late in the second week, almost as an afterthought, when a retired administrator at St. Bernadette's came forward with a sealed incident report from 6 years prior. The contents were unsettling. According to the file, Alice had once reported Martin Dale, a former groundskeeper at the school, for repeated and inappropriate comments of a sexual nature. At the time, Martin was in his early 40s, recently paroled after a conviction related to drug possession and disorderly conduct. He had been hired under a diocese job reintegration program meant to provide second chances. Alice's complaint, though strongly worded, had not resulted in charges, just quiet termination and a sternly worded letter from the school board to the diocese, advising caution. What caught the sheriff's attention wasn't just the timing of that report, but the abruptness with which it had been buried. No follow-up, no public mention. Martin had simply disappeared from the records, until now. Detectives found him living in a trailer 2 counties south, working night shifts at a grain. When questioned, Martin didn't deny knowing Alice. In fact, he seemed to remember her vividly. "Smart lady," he said with a shrug, his hands covered in motor oil. "Didn't like me much, but that's all right." When asked where he was on the morning of November 3rd, his answer was frustratingly precise. He had clocked into work at 6:42 a.m., monitored by a biometric punching system and corroborated by 3 security cameras inside the facility. Video footage showed him sorting grain shipments until nearly 4:00 p.m. that day, never once leaving the property. He even joked, "I've got no time for trouble now. I'm on probation again." Still, the timing of his reappearance in the investigation felt more than coincidental, and Coyle wasn't ready to let go just yet. He ordered a search of Martin's trailer and truck. They found nothing but empty beer cans, mechanical parts, and a copy of a dog-eared Bible with the front pages missing. The sheriff, frustrated but unable to ignore the airtight alibi, reluctantly moved the name to the cleared list, but circled it twice. Meanwhile, something else surfaced, this time from the quiet halls of St. Bernadette's itself. During routine cleanup, Mrs. Dorsey discovered a pink composition notebook wedged behind the radiator in the classroom Alice once taught. It belonged to Julia Morano, a shy 13-year-old known for her drawings and for being one of Alice's favorite students. The journal wasn't part of any assignment. Inside, written in tight cursive and hidden between class notes, were pages of entries that began weeks before Alice vanished. One line in particular caught the attention of investigators. She said some truths aren't safe in confession, and that if she ever told Father Mulligan something, she'd have to be ready for what follows. I don't know what that means, but I think she's scared. The page was dated 10 days before the disappearances. Julia's parents were reluctant to allow questioning, fearing trauma, but under supervision, she sat with 2 detectives in the school library. She remembered the day she wrote that entry. Miss Harper had seemed distracted, flinching when someone knocked at the classroom door. She kept checking her watch and once whispered something to herself before starting the morning prayer. She was praying differently, Julia said, like asking for permission or maybe strength. I didn't understand it. When asked what Miss Harper had said exactly, Julia paused. She said, "He already knows. He always knows. But this time, I won't stay quiet." Julia had thought she was referring to God, or maybe just expressing fear about a school matter. Only now did the words feel heavier. Detectives turned their attention to Father Mulligan. A respected clergyman nearing retirement, he had served the parish for over 3 decades and was known for his stern sermons and unwavering presence at community events. But something about Julia's journal entries hinted at a tension, something unspoken between Alice and the church she served. When asked if Alice had shared anything alarming during recent confessions, Father Mulligan responded with carefully chosen words. Miss Harper was a devoted teacher and servant of God. Whatever burdens she carried, she kept them private, as is the sanctity of confession. He cited canon law and refused further discussion. Still, his reaction raised quiet alarm. One of the detectives later noted, "He never said no, he just refused to talk." The deeper the investigation went, the more it resembled a hall of mirrors. Everyone had an image of Alice, yet no one seemed to know her entirely. Even her journal at the rectory, which investigators returned to, had small, cryptic notations that didn't match the rest of her entries. In the margins of November 1st, someone had written, "Must not forget again, Thursday." Tell him, but who was him? That same evening, one of the younger officers reviewed church volunteer logs stored in a forgotten drawer behind the organ loft. A name stood out, Victor Leary. A former seminarian who had volunteered for landscaping work 2 years prior. He had also been quietly removed after inappropriate interactions with church staff. No charges filed, no records beyond a single disciplinary note. Victor had vanished from dioces's memory, and yet someone had written VL in a faint pencil scrawl in Alice's prayer journal months earlier. The list of people connected to Alice who had left or been removed from the church circle was growing. It felt like threads woven under the surface of what had always appeared to be a peaceful, rural congregation. The kind of church where people left pies at the altar steps and sent their children to learn verses by heart. The most unsettling part wasn't that the leads were cold, it was that they were so carefully covered. Every path forward was either too clean or too coincidental, and yet, under that surface, hints kept bubbling. Old notes, offhand remarks, students remembering sudden changes in routine. Alice hadn't just disappeared, something or someone had carefully erased her. And still, the one piece that didn't make sense was the journal's most chilling phrase, scribbled in pencil on the inside back cover. "Confession doesn't save you if what you know shouldn't be forgiven." As the investigation circled inward toward the sanctuary Alice once trusted, something darker stirred behind the old wooden walls of St. Matthew's. Something waiting. Something silent. 7 years passed in quiet erosion. The name Alice Harper, once etched into every newspaper headline in Albany County, had faded into the collective silence of time. The town of Colburn moved on the way small towns do, not with denial but with a sort of survivalist dullness. The newer residents no longer recognized her face in the yellowing posters that still clung to a few forgotten bulletin boards. The children who once lit candles for her were now young adults, their memories softened and reshaped by years of absence. Sheriff Coyle had retired 2 winters after the 5th anniversary of the case. Father Mulligan had died of a stroke in the rectory, alone in his sleep, and the parish had since changed hands. The new pastor, a soft-spoken man from Syracuse, focused on modernization and growth, often reminding his dwindling congregation of the need to look forward, not back. St. Matthew's itself had deteriorated, the pews warped with age, the bell tower rusted silent, and the faithful grew fewer with each passing year. When the diocese received an offer from a real estate group to purchase the property for redevelopment, they accepted with little ceremony. In early spring, demolition crews arrived to begin clearing the historic church to make way for a shopping plaza, complete with coffee chains and boutique gyms. Most locals didn't object. Some even welcomed the change. Fresh tax revenue, new jobs, maybe a little more light in a town that always seemed stuck in cloud cover. It was on the 3rd day of the teardown, under a slate-gray sky spitting rain, that the discovery was made. Rafael Jimenez, a veteran construction worker from Shroon Lake, had been tasked with dismantling the central chimney structure that extended from the sanctuary to the old furnace room below. The chimney had been out of use for decades, its bricks dark with soot and moisture. As he chipped away at the inner masonry, his chisel hit soft, not damp, not clay, paper. At first he assumed it was insulation or maybe some kind of vermin nest, but when he pried loose the cracked bricks and peered into the narrow gap, he found instead a small, tightly folded sheet of yellowed stationery, brittle around the edges, protected by the very soot that had once blackened it. He called over his foreman, and together they unfolded it slowly, carefully, brushing away flakes of ash. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, sharp, deliberate, and pressed deep into the fibers as though written in urgency or with trembling resolve. It began without salutation and bore no date, but ended with two small but chilling details. A signature, H.A., and a final line in shaky script, "I can't stay silent any longer." The crew, uncertain of what they'd found, reported the note to their site manager, who in turn contacted the town office. The mayor, a pragmatic woman named Deirdre Nolan, ordered a halt to the demolition until law enforcement could assess the discovery. Within hours, news crews had returned to Colburn for the first time in years. Microphones poked through the fence, drone cameras hovered over piles of stone and shattered stained glass. For the first time in nearly a decade, Alice Harper's name was again spoken on television, this time alongside words like breakthrough and reopening of investigation. The letter itself was taken into evidence and scanned for preservation. The ink, though faded, remained close, almost like a confession, but riddled with fear. Phrases like, "I was wrong to trust him," and "he said the sins would be forgiven if I stayed quiet," haunted the line. It made no explicit reference to names, places, or acts, but the context, when read against the backdrop of her disappearance, was damning in its implications. Experts analyzed the paper and ink, but decided to go with system with 2016, the year Alice vanished. Detective Mara Ellsworth, the newly assigned lead on cold cases at the Albany County Sheriff's Department, took immediate interest. She had been in middle school when Alice disappeared. Now, in her 30s, she approached the case with the fresh perspective of someone detached from the politics and paralysis of the original investigation. She ordered a re-examination of everything: Alice's journals, her interactions with the church, her complaints, and most crucially, the names buried quietly in the administrative logs. She also requested full access to the original floor plans of St. Matthew's and the rectory, curious about why a woman would hide a letter inside the chimney unless she was trying to preserve it or conceal it. Raphael, the worker who had found the letter, agreed to an interview. He explained how the note had been pressed deep inside a structural gap, almost impossible to notice unless the bricks were being removed from a specific angle. "It wasn't dropped," he said firmly. "It was hidden, on purpose." Word of the letter's discovery spread fast. Retired staff from St. Bernadette's began to recall fragments of memory with renewed clarity, or perhaps guilt. A cafeteria worker remembered seeing Alice walking alone into the chapel the morning before she vanished, wrapped in her gray shawl and moving slowly, like someone already carrying something unbearable. A former altar boy, now a college student, emailed the sheriff's office claiming he once saw Alice and Father Mulligan arguing behind the sacristy, though at the time he assumed it was about hymn selection. Detective Ellsworth requested access to diocesan records regarding clergy discipline and complaints filed during Father Mulligan's tenure. Her request was denied, citing religious confidentiality and ecclesiastical protection. Undeterred, she filed for a subpoena. More fragments surfaced. A man who worked in heating repair remembered being called to the church weeks before Alice vanished to inspect a blackage in the old chimney flue. He had never filed a report because he found nothing, but he did recall someone in the rectory being very adamant that he not remove any bricks, only clear from below. He couldn't recall who made the request, only that they wore a rosary and seemed tense. The deeper Ellsworth dug, the more the silence around Alice Harper felt deliberate. Not the silence of grief, but of institution. And if someone had gone to the trouble of hiding a letter in an unused chimney, one that wouldn't be accessed unless the truth was destroyed, it meant they believed they wouldn't live to speak the truth out loud. Or worse, they weren't allowed. But if Alice wrote the letter, the question became clear. Why hide it instead of giving it to someone? Who was she trying to protect or fear? And most of all, what truth was too dangerous to speak? Detective Mara Ellsworth read the letter again and again under the cold fluorescent lights of the county archives office, each word etched deeper into her thoughts with every pass. The letter was a plea, cloaked in restraint, an urgent whisper locked in brick. One paragraph in particular gnawed at her, the one where Alice had written, I was summoned for confession after hours. He said it had to be done in private, outside of church schedule. I thought it odd, but I obeyed. I shouldn't have. That wasn't confession. It was something else. It wasn't safe. The words summoned, after hours, and wasn't safe danced uneasily in Mara's mind, suggesting not only a breach of trust, but something darker, perhaps predatory or coercive. That line was dated, as best the ink and paper could be matched, to the night Alice disappearing. The implications were chilling. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was potentially the cover-up of a spiritual violation, if not outright abuse. Her next step was to reconstruct the clergy hierarchy of St. Matthew's in 2016. Beyond Father Mulligan, who had died in 2019, there had been only one other authority with the rank and power to operate without oversight in that parish, Bishop Theodore Rains. At the time of Alice's disappearance, Bishop Rains was the ecclesiastical head of the Albany Diocese and had visited St. Matthew's occasionally for confirmations and administrative reviews. On the surface, Rains had an impeccable reputation, a soft-spoken man in his 70s, known for community engagement and theological scholarship. But what caught Merritt's eye wasn't his biography. It was his sudden transfer, logged exactly 7 days after Alice vanished. The document cited health reasons and a voluntary sabbatical. In less than 2 weeks, he had been reassigned to a remote post in Nevada, a move so abrupt and unexplained it didn't sit right with Mara. She pulled personnel memos, emails, travel logs, anything she could request through legal channels. The most striking document was an internal memo from the Diocesan Administrative Office dated November 9, 2016, marked Confidential. It simply read, "Bishop R. requested reassignment. Please expedite with discretion." There was no medical record, no formal process, just a quiet shuffling of a very powerful man out of the diocese. Mara then contacted the Nevada Diocese. Bishop Rains was still alive, retired now in a private residence provided by the church. They declined to arrange an interview. When she pushed further, requesting a formal statement, she received only a terse response from the Diocesan Legal Counsel. "Bishop Rains is in poor health and is not available for comment. We encourage you to respect his privacy during this stage of life." But Mara wasn't ready to stop. She reached out to a former assistant to Rains, Father Donnelly, who had since left the priesthood and was now teaching ethics at a community college in western Pennsylvania. On a video call late one evening, Donnelly leaned into the camera, his face warm and hair grayer than his photo on the college website. "I knew her," he said quietly, after Mara introduced herself, Sister Alice. She was the kind of person you remember. Never loud, never confrontational, but she had this light. And I think that light made her dangerous to some people. Mara asked what he meant. There was tension, he admitted. In the months before she vanished, she was asking questions about fund allocations, student counseling procedures, even who had access to the confession logs. It rubbed some people the wrong way. She didn't care for hierarchy when it got in the way of truth. Then Mara asked him about Bishop Rains's sudden transfer. Donnelly's face hardened. "You won't find a paper trail, but I'll tell you this, he was nervous that week. I'd never seen him like that. He canceled meetings, locked himself in the rectory office for hours, and when I saw him on the day he left, he was shaking." Not sick, scared. Donnelly said one more thing before signing off. If Alice left a letter, it means she knew she was in danger, and she still tried to speak. That tells you everything about who she was, but also how much she feared what would happen if she didn't hide it well. The letter's mention of a private confession became the focal point. Mara reviewed all known confession protocols at the time. Confessions were to be recorded in schedule books for transparency, even if names were never listed. Yet the evening of November 3, 2016, held no such entry. No logs, no notes, no indication anyone had entered the booth that night. Then, in the parish's paper archives, stored in a locked room beneath the new diocesan office, she found a stray page from a maintenance logbook. It noted an unscheduled furnace inspection requested on the night of November 3rd. The person who signed it? Not a technician, but And why would a bishop sign for a furnace inspection? And why at night? Mara traced the furnace location. It was directly beneath the confessional chamber. She visited the demolition site again, now a leveled expanse of rubble. The only parts left standing were the base of the chimney and a few pieces of floor tile from the sanctuary. The original confessional had been dismantled 2 weeks prior, but a foreman mentioned something strange. The floor under the booth was reinforced, he said. We had to use a diamond blade to get through it. Looked like it had been patched over at some point, maybe with concrete. Back at the sheriff's office, Mara studied the site photos taken during demolition. There, among the piles of plaster and wood, was a strange discoloration on the foundation slab where the confessional had once stood. A darker patch in the cement, circular, like it had once covered something. The idea hit her with a slow, sick certainty. What if the confession wasn't just spiritual? What if it was an ambush, a trap? She requested forensic review of the recovered cement samples from that area. While she waited, she traced Bishop Raines's final sermon before he left Albany. It had been a Sunday homily delivered to a nearly empty church, and it had ended with an unusual line for a man of his position: "Some sins do not beg for forgiveness, they simply wait in silence for the reckoning." Mara printed that line in bold and pinned it next to the letter from Alice. 2 voices, 1 warning. The reckoning, it seemed, had only just begun. Detective Mara Ellsworth had barely slept in days. The revelations about Bishop Raines and the eerie final sermon he left behind weighed heavily on her, but it was the suggestion of the hidden confession, both spiritual and architectural, that pushed her forward. As she waited for the lab results on the cement samples taken from beneath the old confessional, she returned to the temporary records office set up for the church's demolition site. There, volunteers and staff were sifting through decades of stored paperwork, photo albums, and stained attendance sheets in cardboard boxes. Most of it was mundane: bad sale rosters, baptism schedules, handwritten hymn selections, but Mara believed that if Alice Harper's disappearance was silenced by an institution, then somewhere within these banal relics would be a misfiled moment that slipped past the censors. That moment arrived not in a file, but through the unexpected voice of someone long forgotten by the town. On a cold Thursday morning, as the St. Bernadette's Parish Food Pantry hosted its regular clothing drive for those in need, a woman named Lorraine Marks shuffled in, wearing a threadbare army jacket and dragging a squeaky-wheeled cart behind her. Lorraine had been on the fringes of Colburn for years, a familiar figure wandering near train yards and sleeping behind the old grain warehouse. She wasn't new to the food line, but that morning she noticed the small flyer pinned on the church's sideboard, with Alice Harper's name and face above the headline, "New Clues in Long Cold Case." Lorraine stared at it for a long time before quietly pulling a volunteer aside. "I know her," she said. "The night." Within hours, Mara was sitting across from Lorraine in the rectory's empty meeting room, recorder on, hands folded. Lorraine's voice was scratchy, warm from cigarettes and years of silence, but steady. "I was sleeping by the steps of O'Connell's Hardware across the street. It was cold. I remember because I only had 1 glove. That church," she said, nodding toward the window, "was lit up like someone forgot to turn the lights off. Not normal that late. Around 10, I think. I saw her. That woman. She was small, walked like a dancer, you know, always looking down. She went through the side entrance by the alley." Mara leaned forward. "Are you certain it was Alice Harper?" Malum continued to be studying. "I never forget a face. She used to give me granola bars when I passed by her school. I saw her go in, waited another hour just lying there, staring at the same door. She never came back out. Lights went off around midnight. No one else came in or out." Mara cross-referenced Lorraine's memory with what they knew. The church logs were blank. There were no scheduled events that evening, no night masses or choir rehearsals. The alley door Lorraine described had no surveillance coverage and had been considered inconsequential during the original investigation. Her testimony gave Mara a timestamp, a detail that finally placed Alice inside the church after hours. But more than that, it confirmed what Alice herself had hinted at in the letter, that she entered willingly, expecting something safe, and encountered something else entirely. Encouraged by the testimony, Mara instructed her team to dig deeper into archived visual materials, especially ones documenting the interior and lower levels of St. Matthew's before the renovations in 2017. Among the scanned records sent from the diocese's image archive was a series of photos labeled "Property Damage, Winter Flooding." They dated back to December 2016, 1 month after Alice's disappearance. The images were meant to show signs of water damage in the church basement, possibly for insurance claims. Most of them were unremarkable: warped paneling, stained walls, a collapsed utility shelf, but one photograph, poorly lit and slightly tilted, caught Mara's attention. It had been taken facing a narrow corridor that led to the furnace room, the same location Alice's furnace inspection was allegedly requested from. In the background, beyond a smudged glass pane set in a heavy steel door, was the faint silhouette of a human figure. The person was partially obscured, but the outline was unmistakable. The grain of the image and reflection from a nearby utility light made it difficult to distinguish features, but Mara zoomed in and froze. The most unnerving detail was that the photo had a timestamp, December 8, 2016, more than a month after Alice disappeared. She sent the photo to the lab for image enhancement and ran a scan of any staff or contractors who might have been on site that day. The file said the basement had been closed off following structural concerns raised earlier that fall and sealed shortly after the photograph was taken. No maintenance crew logged a visit on that day. The photo had been taken by an insurance adjuster who had since moved to Oregon. When reached, he recalled nothing unusual. "I was snapping damage shots for records," he said. "Didn't even notice the figure until now." Mara requested the original negatives and had the tech team run every known enhancement technique. A week later, the analysis returned a chilling result. The figure was likely a woman, based on shoulder width and height. Clothing appeared to be consistent with a gray shawl. No facial detail could be recovered. But whoever she was, she had been standing inside a locked and sealed basement section, behind a door that hadn't been opened. That section had been walled off during the 2017 renovations and had since been lost beneath the new foundation. For Mara, this discovery wasn't merely about eerie images or witness statements anymore. It was about a timeline no longer matching what the church had claimed. Alice was in that building, and someone, possibly multiple people, had ensured she wouldn't leave alive for days after her disappearance. Maybe longer, sealed in, hidden. She returned to Lorraine, showed her the photo. The older woman squinted, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for the laminated print. "That's the window by the furnace," she whispered. "I've slept near there too, always gave me the creeps, like someone watching. But I didn't know." She trailed off. Mara felt her chest tighten. Everything was unraveling, and yet the picture became clearer. Alice had gone into the church willingly. She'd met someone she knew, trusted, perhaps. She had been confined, maybe silenced, and now all that remained was a photo of a shadowed face behind glass, a letter in soot, and a truth too long buried under stone and stained hymns. Detective Mara Ellsworth stared at the blueprint spread across the long wooden table in the county planning office, her index finger tracing the lines of the original floor plan of St. Matthew's Church. The current file, dated 2003, showed a modest basement with 2 utility rooms and a small furnace space. But there were inconsistencies. Earlier photographs showed foundation seams and support columns that didn't line up with this map. Something was missing. She leaned back, eyes narrowing, then requested archived city records dating back to before the church's conversion from a monastic facility in the 1950s. After hours of combing through brittle documents, she found a folder, misfiled under Miss Phelim, access to an instant that held gold. Inside were the original 1910 blueprints, yellowed and fading, but still intact. These revealed a detail the current ones omitted: a sub-basement level built with stone and iron reinforcements, used during its years as a cloistered monastery. On the lower right quadrant of the page, labeled faintly in cursive, was a note. The air in the room grew heavier. Mara whispered aloud. They built a prison under a church. She scanned for stair access. The entry had once been through a trap door beneath the rectory's southern wing, access point sealed during renovations in the early 70s, with no mention in diocesan updates since. The decision to omit this entire section from the modern schematic was deliberate. Someone wanted it forgotten or hidden. The next morning, Mara met with Carl Underwood, the structural engineer who'd overseen the church demolition team. When she showed him the 1910 blueprint, his eyes widened. "We thought that was a myth," he muttered. "We hit concrete that didn't match the rest of the foundation, real thick, old stuff. We figured it was early stormwater drainage or something from the old orphanage days." She pointed to the drawing. It wasn't drainage. That's a cell block. Carl nodded slowly. Then someone covered it up, literally, poured new concrete over the access shaft. Would have taken days and needed approval. But we never found any permits. Fueled by this new evidence, Mara filed for an emergency excavation order, but the process was slow, mired in bureaucratic resistance and ecclesiastical objections. While she waited, she returned to interviews. One afternoon, she received a call from Father Donnelly, the former priest turned ethics professor. His voice was more urgent than before. "There's someone you need to speak to," he said. "He's at St. Jude's Hospice. Name's Emmett Clark. He was a sacristan at St. Matthew's for over 40 years. He's dying, and he wants to unburden himself." That evening, Mara visited the hospice, where she found Emmett in a dim room smelling of lavender and antiseptic. His skin was paper-thin, his hands spotted and trembling. But his eyes were alert, sharp behind the glaze of age. He recognized her immediately. "Cat was a light," he rasped. "That girl, Alice, too bright for that place." When asked what he meant, he sighed. "There are things I should have said long ago, but back then, speaking up meant exile. Or worse." He leaned forward, breath shallow. "One night, must have been the winter she went missing, coldest week of the year. I was in the rectory, stoking the old boiler. Around midnight I heard it." He coughed violently, then continued. "A voice, faint, coming from the flue. It said, 'Help,' just once, but it was real." Mara froze. "You're saying someone called for help from inside the chimney?" He nodded slowly. "Plutioned inside the chimney. From below it." That flue ran through the old cloister chambers. They were still partially open, though no one talked about them. I tried to follow the sound, but the trapdoor to the old cells had been welded shut. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I did. Father Mulligan, he said I was overtired, imagining things, and then the next day they had workers come in, poured concrete over the door. After that, I never heard it again." He looked at her with haunted eyes. "But I know what I heard." Mara left the hospice reeling. His account, though fragmented by age, matched everything: the hidden sub-basement, the sailed access, the voice from the chimney. She returned to the original photograph of the woman behind the basement glass and stared at it again, imagining Alice trapped beneath stone and ash, her voice muffled by decades of indifference. The forensic report on the cement samples arrived that evening. They confirmed multiple pore layers, one original dating back to the 1940s, and another much newer, added sometime between November 2016 and January 2017. That timeline was crucial. Someone had sealed that space shortly after Alice vanished, and they had done so in secret. Mara pushed for immediate ground-penetrating radar to scan the remaining undeveloped land where the rectory once stood. If there were rooms buried beneath, the radar would find them. The team deployed their equipment within 48 hours. The results were chilling. A rectangular void measuring roughly 12 by 20 feet lay beneath the area once covered by the rectory's east wing. The chamber had no entrance from above, completely encased in concrete. When Mara received the 3D visual scan, she felt the breath catch in her throat. Inside the chamber was a faint metallic shape, a chair maybe, or a cot. Beside it, a second object, small, irregular, a human outline distorted by layers of stone. She leaned in closer. It was impossible to tell for sure, but the shape was consistent with a curled body, knees drawn to chest. Waiting. Long forgotten. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then she whispered, not to anyone in particular. She was down there all this time. But the confirmation of that presence, what remained, who placed her there, and whether she had truly died in the dark or lived for days, still lingered, unanswered, inside the cold, concrete echo chamber just below the surface. The excavation began just after sunrise, under the watchful eye of the State Preservation Team and a forensic archaeologist brought in from Cornell. The area where the rectory once stood had been cordoned off, the soil carefully shaved away layer by layer until the reinforced concrete slab beneath was exposed like a buried secret. A silence hung over the site, not from reverence, but tension, a collective sense that whatever lay beneath this patch of earth had been intentionally erased. After 2 days of grinding and chipping, the team reached the subfloor's edge and located the hollow cavity confirmed by ground-penetrating radar. The trapdoor, once sealed with steel and concrete, was cut open with industrial saws, revealing a narrow stone stairwell descending into stale, airless dark. The stairwell opened into a cramped stone room, no larger than a single jail cell. The air inside was thick with rot and dust, disturbed for the first time in nearly a decade. The flashlight beam swept across rough stone walls, the ancient mortar between bricks cracked with age. Near the back corner of the room, just below a rusted metal vent that once connected to the church's old heating system, lay the first clue. A broken rosary, its beads scattered like seeds across the cold floor. Beside it, barely visible until light struck it at an angle, were faint scratch marks, curved, frantic, etched into the wall. They were not old carvings, but desperate attempts, claw marks made by human nails dragged across stone. The forensic team marked each groove, measuring angles, depth, pressure. They collected fragments of keratin embedded in the wall. Nearby, tangled in the broken rosary, they found several strands of dark hair caught in a rusty bolt. Mara stood on the edge of the chamber, wearing gloves and a respirator, watching as the team worked in silence. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the far wall, where a smear of dried brown marked a downward arc near the floor. A blood stain, possibly from a head wound, now aged and oxygized. This wasn't a place of retreat, the archaeologist said grimly. This was containment. A prison. When Mara asked how long someone might survive in such a space, the response was curt. Depends on airflow. If the vent was functional, maybe a few days. If it was blocked, she didn't finish the sentence. Samples of the blood, hair, and keratin were rushed to the lab. The results came back 48 hours later. The DNA from the hair and dried blood both matched the genetic profile of Alice Harper, confirmed by her family's previous submissions. The fingernail fragments, though degraded, carried enough trace material to confirm the same match. But there was no body, no bones, no clothing remains, beyond a few decayed fabric fibers near the cot. Alice had undeniably been there. She had bled there. She had clawed at the walls. But what happened after, whether she died in that space or was removed before the chamber was sealed, remained a void. The presence of the rosary added another layer. It was a handcrafted wooden bead design, unique to the Sisters of Mercy, with initials A hanging on the crucifix. She'd carried it for years. Photos of her in the classroom often showed it looped around her wrist or tucked beside her lesson plans. The fact that it was broken, beads scattered like the aftermath of struggle or despair, suggested she had not gone quietly. Back in the station, Mara compiled everything into a new case file, labeled Recovered Evidence from Subayazment 1A. The photographs were harrowing, the claw marks, the blood arc, the abandoned rosary. Yet none of it provided a definitive conclusion. There was no explanation of how Alice got into the chamber, who had sealed it, or if someone had been watching her suffer from above. Worse, if she had died there, where was the body? Had someone returned later to remove it before pouring the concrete? If so, who had the authority, the time, and the coldness to erase her final resting place so completely? Public interest reignited overnight. News vans returned to Colburn. Talk shows debated the meaning of the chamber and what it said about institutional silence. Some locals gathered outside the excavation site, leaving flowers, candles, and cards that read, "We never forgot you." Others whispered fears in supermarkets and parking lots, afraid that the church had hidden more than just a girl. Mara received tips, most of them speculative. But one stood out. A retired maintenance man named Richard Klein, who once worked for the diocese's facilities department, contacted her through an anonymous letter. It read, "Check the contractor list from Deck 2016. You'll find only initials. That's not oversight. That's on purpose. Look for who had keys." Merrill pulled old invoice records. The maintenance entry for the concrete pour that sealed the rectory's east wing listed no full names, just Team E/weekend crew. No phone numbers, no permits filed, no equipment logs. When she tracked the purchasing order, the credit card used was linked not to the diocese account, but a private discretionary fund, connected directly to the late Bishop Raines. It wasn't just hidden, it was financed off the books. More disturbingly, a forensic examination of the cement used in the seal revealed a specific admixture formula only used by one supplier in upstate New York, a supplier under exclusive contract with the church's internal maintenance division. This wasn't an outside job. Someone from inside had ordered the concrete, delivered it without documentation, and supervised its use during a weekend no records existed for. Mara circled the delivery date, December 10, 2016, just 2 days after the streamed photo was taken in the basement, the one showing a shadow behind the glass. The pieces were converging. Alice had been lured to the church under the guise of confession. She was confined in a chamber erased from maps. She left behind signs of struggle, and someone inside the church, not a stranger, but someone with keys, access, and authority, had overseen her silence. But if she had died there, why remove her body? Why not leave it to rot in that darkness where no one would ever find it? Unless she hadn't died there at all. The air around the case had grown heavier with each new discovery, but nothing prepared Mara Ellsworth for what landed in the inbox of the local Cairburn Gazette late one Tuesday morning. The email, sent from a temporary anonymous address routed through multiple proxies, contained no subject line, only a few cold lines of text and a cryptic attachment labeled, "For truth's sake." The body of the message read, "I was there that night. I didn't know what I was part of, not fully, but I was told by someone I feared, someone I owed, to lock the basement door behind me. I didn't ask why. I didn't look back. I'm sorry." It was signed only, "A priest who should have done more." The editor, stunned, forwarded it immediately to Mara, who had already been exploring the possibility that someone in the clergy, not necessarily Bishop Raines, not necessarily Father Mulligan, had acted as the final hand in sealing Alice's fate. This confession confirmed it. She requested metadata from the Gazette's IT team. Though stripped of identifiable markers, a buried server IP pointed faintly toward a seminary archive in Rochester. That location had once served as a satellite training facility affiliated with the Albany Diocese and housed many young priests in training, particularly during the mid-2010s. She requested access to the seminary's roster from 2016. One name leapt out, Father Colin Byrne, age 27 at the time, now reportedly in Italy, working in an outreach ministry. She searched for photos, records, anything, and there, in a faded staff bulletin, stood a smiling, younger Byrne in his training collar, listed as temporary deacon assistant to Bishop Raines. She printed it, circled his name, and pinned it next to the email printout. As she prepared to push for a subpoena, or possibly an international request for questioning, a second and even more damning revelation surfaced. One of the church archivists, spurred by recent media attention, came forward with a box of cassette tapes, previously stored in a mislabeled filing cabinet beneath the diocesan's media library. They were relics from the old days when confessions, under special circumstances, were sometimes recorded for clerical accountability during disputes. Most were unusable, erased, damaged, or inaudible, but one stood out. It was dated November 3, 2016, and marked with red wax. The archivist, fearing consequences, refused to listen to it himself, but passed it directly to Mara under a condition of anonymity. She took the tape to the lab for digital restoration. The audio team cleaned up the static, removed layers of tape hiss, and enhanced vocal clarity. What emerged was faint but unmistakably human. Two voices, one male, older, calm, the other, a female voice on the verge of breaking, Alice. Her voice wavered, but her words were clear. "Father, I need to speak plainly. I've seen things. Girls, one in particular, brought into the counseling room, not for help, but for silence. They were told not to speak, threatened, guilted. One told me the man who hurt her was someone high up. I tried to go to the superintendent, but he said it was being handled internally. That we couldn't risk scandal." There was a pause, the sangle we need both. Then she added, "I can't stay quiet anymore. If I don't say it now, I'll be complicit." The male voice, likely Bishop Raines, responded softly, "You must understand the weight of accusation. The church cannot weather another storm. You must trust us to deal with it in our own way." Alice's response was sharper this time. "You've had time, and still they're here, in uniform, walking these halls." There was silence, then the unmistakable scrape of a chair. The recording ended abruptly. Mara sat with her hands clenched tight. The tape, if verified, was irrefutable evidence that Alice had attempted to expose an abuse cover-up within the church's own walls, and rather than support her, rather than protect the students she taught, someone had stepped forward not to destroy, but to defend, and was punished for it. She returned to the photos taken inside the hidden chamber. One detail she had overlooked suddenly mattered: the vent grate above the cot. It connected directly to the old chimney flue, the same chimney where her letter was found. If Alice had tried to call for help, that vent was likely her only connection to the world above, and it meant that her last conscious act may have been a desperate attempt to push that letter into the only space where someone might one day find it. Mara pulled the restoration audio and the anonymous priest's email together into a report for the state attorney's office. She knew prosecution might be impossible. Too much time had passed, too many players had disappeared or died, but the moral imperative burned. People had to know. The silence had protected predators. The silence had killed Alice. She revisited the hospital where Emmett Clark had last spoken to her. The hospice nurse said he'd passed just 3 days prior. At his bedside, she'd found a final note tucked into his prayer book. In shaky handwriting it read, "She knocked. I heard it, and I turned away. Forgive me." And still, the deepest question clawed at Mara's mind. If someone silenced Alice to stop her from exposing the truth, how far were they willing to go to keep others quiet too? Detective Mara Ellsworth knew she was standing at the edge of something far larger than she had anticipated. The recovered tape, the anonymous email, the physical evidence from the chamber, they all pointed to a systematic attempt to silence Alice Harper after she threatened to reveal what she had discovered. But the question that remained, the one she hadn't yet allowed herself to say aloud, was this: who was she trying to expose? The identity of the abuser Alice had alluded to on the confession tape remained unspoken, but it was now clear he held significant authority, enough to scare a bishop into reassignment and convince a seminary assistant to seal a chamber without question. With the help of a confidential informant in the diocesan personnel archives, Mara obtained a list of clergy with administrative ties to both St. Bernadette's and St. Matthew's during 2016. Most were lower-tier staff, chaplains, visiting deacons. Only one name appeared across both institutions, both as a supervisor and, briefly, as Alice Harper's direct pastoral liaison: Father Mitchell Carr. Father Carr had once served quietly, dutifully, first as an educator, then as a spiritual counselor. But in the years since Alice's disappearance, he had risen rapidly through church ranks. Now, nearly a decade later, he was Archbishop Carr, the head of a sprawling diocese in Ohio with nearly 500,000 parishioners and growing political clout. He regularly appeared on national faith networks, penned editorials on moral resilience, and led multi-million-dollar fundraising campaigns. His public persona was untouchable, but privately, Mara found records that troubled her. Carr had received at least 3 informal complaints between 2015 and 2016, none of which reached law enforcement. 2 were labeled resolved internally, the third simply marked inconclusive. All 3 had one thing in common: they came from female faculty or students involved in church-affiliated programs. She brought this information to the state attorney, who cautioned her to tread carefully. Any public accusation would trigger immediate legal and political backlash. Still, Mara prepared a sealed memorandum detailing the findings. She was readying to deliver it when the FBI contacted her directly. An envelope had arrived at their regional field office, postmarked from Michigan, with no return address. Inside was a typed letter, plain, impersonal, but explosive. It read, "Alice Harper's body was never hidden. It was moved, switched during the funeral of Bishop Raines. She is buried beneath his name. I was there. The casket was resealed before final rites." The letter ended with a single line: "You'll find the truth beneath the stone." The claim was outrageous, even grotesque, but Mara couldn't ignore it. She reviewed footage and documentation from the 2020 funeral of Bishop Raines, held with traditional ceremony at the historic cemetery in Albany County, where senior clergy were often interred. Records showed the bishop's casket was closed during the entire service, by which Smith died, and was sealed by church staff before family arrived. The mortuary logs were incomplete. The funeral director on file had since retired, but when contacted, he remembered feeling uncomfortable during the preparation. "They had their own guy," he said. "Showed up early, said he'd handle the embalming. I'd never seen that before." Mara requested an exhumation order. The legal battle that followed was immediate and intense. Church lawyers called it a desecration. But under mounting pressure from the public and newly awakened federal interest, the judge approved the request under the condition that the process remain discreet and supervised. 3 weeks later, under early dawn light and heavy mist, the bishop's grave was opened. The casket was lifted, then carefully unsealed. Inside lay a body dressed in episcopal garments, hands folded over a gold cross. At first glance, it appeared authentic, but the forensic team noted discrepancies almost immediately. The bone structure was smaller than expected for Raines's known height and frame. The clothing fit awkwardly, the fabric bulked unnaturally around the shoulders. DNA was taken from beneath the fingernails and compared against samples from Raines's personal effects. No match. Then the team took a hair sample from the base of the skull and ran it against the forensic profile of Alice Harper. It matched. The revelation sent tremors through the investigation. Mara didn't release the information publicly at first. She needed more. The casket had been switched. Alice's body, undiscovered for years, had been placed under the identity of the very bishop who had silenced her. Someone had arranged a funeral for the wrong corpse. The motive was as cruel as it was calculated. Bury her permanently, beneath honor, beneath holy soil, beneath a name revered by thousands. Whoever had orchestrated the deception had done so with complete control over the death process, from autopsy to burial. It was a cover-up not only of abuse, but of physical evidence. The last trace of Alice had been hidden in plain sight. Behind closed doors, Mara confronted senior diocesan officials. Most denied knowledge. Some looked away. One broke into tears, but said nothing. Finally, she returned to the tapes, the transcripts, and the photo evidence. She circled one detail repeatedly. Father Carr had been present at Raines's funeral. Not just present, he had led the final blessing. His signature was on the burial authorization. His words, caught on camera that day, rang now with horrifying irony. "In death, we honor a life of service, of truth, and of eternal light." Mara watched the footage again. This time, she saw not a tribute, but a final act of erasure. And still there was no direct link, no recording, no confession. The man who may have orchestrated it all stood at the pulpit in another state, untouched, preaching righteousness to thousands. She had everything, except the moment he crossed the line. By the time the forensic results confirmed that the body buried under Bishop Raines's name belonged to Alice Harper, the media frenzy had reached a boiling point. Nationwide outlets swarmed Colburn, seeking interviews, aerial shots of the cemetery, and confrontations with anyone associated with the diocese. Yet even with irrefutable DNA evidence, the response from both church and civic authorities remained cautious, carefully worded, and evasive. The district attorney's office acknowledged the possibility of procedural mishandling of remains, but refused to classify the situation as a criminal case. When pressed, the statement read, "Further investigation into decisions made during the 2020 funeral is ongoing. No public comment will be made regarding a decision to assign all worthy attorney return to the site of the demolished St. Matthew's Church one last time." The building was gone, replaced by the skeletal beginnings of a modern shopping complex, rebar rising where stained glass once filtered sunlight onto pews. Yet one section, she noticed, remained untouched. A rectangular plot marked by fencing and security tape had been excluded from demolition entirely. She requested access to the zone, citing her open investigation, but was denied by city development officials. A formal response. The area contains substructure of historical and religious significance. Per recommendation from the State Commission on Sacred Architecture, all further excavation is prohibited until reviewed. When she asked if that included the sub-basement chamber where Alice had been found, the official's eyes shifted. "We can't comment on matters involving ecclesiastical preservation." It was the same pattern: delay, obscure, retreat. That chamber, Alice's prison, would be buried again, not with cement this time, but bureaucracy. Mara filed an appeal, even as she suspected the process would be buried under layers of paperwork and religious exemptions. The truth, though exposed, would be entombed once more. The The church remained publicly silent, did not appear for interviews, and was rumored to have left the country for spiritual retreat. Mara requested surveillance of the airport, but by the time any warrants were issued, it was too late. He was gone. Meanwhile, the recovered evidence, the tape, the DNA, the photos, the confession email, was turned over to the FBI's regional office, now labeled as sensitive religious materials. But internally, Mara knew momentum had slowed. Without a living suspect, without a formal body to prosecute, the system sought equilibrium, closure, not justice. And yet, something refused to settle. 1 week after the investigation officially closed, Mara received a USB drive from a demolition contractor who had worked the St. Matthew's site. He had quietly saved a copy of the final days of surveillance footage from the camera mounted on the east lot, the only unit that hadn't been removed before full teardown. "I didn't tell anyone I kept it," he said in a hushed voicemail. "But there's something in it. I didn't know who to give it to except you." The footage spanned 37 hours, capturing time-lapsed images of trucks, dust clouds, loaders, and laborers. Most of it was unremarkable, but on frame 33/27/14, Mara saw movement that froze her breath. Behind a flatbed truck loaded with broken brick and steel, a figure emerged from the far side of the frame. A woman walking calmly, almost casually, into view for less than 5 seconds. She wore a white-collared shirt, wrinkled, with sleeves rolled up, and dark trousers. Her face turned only partially toward the camera, but her features, angular jaw, sunken cheeks, sharp chin, strikingly resembled the missing schoolteacher from every photo in the Harper file. There was no one else in that corner of the lot. No demolition logs reported staff moving materials on foot, and most importantly, the timestamp matched exactly 6:03 a.m., the morning of the final day of clearance, when the site was supposed to be fully cleared and locked. Mara zoomed in, ran facial matching against known photos of Alice. The algorithm returned a 94% match, factoring age regression. The problem? If Alice had died, if her body had truly been recovered and reburied, this woman shouldn't exist, and yet there she was, impossibly alive, or at least someone who bore her exact likeness, present on the ruins of the very site that once silenced her. She ran the clip over and over. The woman did not appear startled. She did not run. She walked with purpose, as if she belonged, as if she had been waiting. And then she vanished behind the loader. The next 30 minutes of footage showed nothing but dust. Mara submitted the footage to the FBI. They said it would be analyzed, but no one followed up. No alert, no request for public help identifying the woman. Internally, she was told to focus her resources elsewhere. Case closed, they said. All evidence accounted for. But Mara knew what she saw. She had spent years reading people, chasing ghosts, building timelines. This wasn't an illusion. It wasn't a misfiled clip. It was real. And if it was real, then someone had either faked a death to erase a witness, or Alice Harper had survived, escaped, and returned. Not for justice, not for revenge, but maybe, just maybe, to leave a final mark. As winter approached, the site was paved over. A future coffee shop, a fitness center, a pet supply chain all announced openings for the coming spring. The past, like the floor tiles once buried under pews, would disappear beneath polished new stone. But Mara printed a still from the footage and pinned it to her office wall. Beneath it, she wrote only 2 words in black ink. She walked. If this story left you speechless, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more real-life mysteries with unexpected twists. What part shocked you the most? Do you think Alice Harper really survived? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We always love seeing how far these stories travel.